Hi everyone. I thought I'd do a quick video to recap on the question of multiculturalism, which not many of you have attempted, but it is important we touch on it before we finish Unit 1. So, because we talk about respect and we talk about awareness of others, and particularly others in terms of ethnicity and race and culture, multiculturalism is a word that often pops up in this unit. It has to be looked at with caution, because first of all, you need to actually divide the term multiculturalism into two different understanding. Multiculturalism sometimes is used in a very sort of a generic way. So when we talk about multiculturalism in the press, we'll talk about multiculturalism in pop culture, or we talk about it in school. Usually, it's really technical meaning, and it's a bit of a shallow meaning. So for the reasons of schools and schooling and education generally, if by multiculturalism we just mean a certain awareness of other cultures, it's not going to be sufficient for the sort of concerns that we have in this unit. The kind of examples that I'm thinking about is, for example, practices of International Culture Day, diverse food festivals in schools. That is not multiculturalism. It's somewhere on the path towards multiculturalism, but it's not multiculturalism, not by its technical meaning. So multiculturalism in Canada, we're one of the only countries where it's actually defined in a constitutional sense. And multiculturalism in Canada, as it's defined in the constitutional framework, is a very, very strong concept that goes far, far beyond just this curiosity and awareness of cultures within our society and within our schools. So multiculturalism, in its strictest sense within Canada, means that we are accepting that people who come to Canada from elsewhere have the right to retain their own culture and their own language without being assimilated. And we are very different from the US in the sense that, the phrase normally used to describe the immigration process in the US is the melting pot. And the US prides itself on this notion of melting pot. What does the melting pot mean? It means that people come from elsewhere, yes, from many different places, but they assimilated and they lose culture and they lose language, and they become primarily American, coming from elsewhere. And that's the notion of melting pot, is that actually all these cultures have melted into something new. That is not how Canada defines itself. Canada defines itself as a multicultural country, and that's where it goes at the core of our constitutional sort of values. And in that sense, we say that we respect the fact that people come from elsewhere, but they can retain their language and retain their culture and their habits and their ways of living. This is a very strong concept. So I'll give you an example, because sometimes I see teachers who talk about multiculturalism but without realizing the sort of reflection that it requires. And particularly when we talk about Eurocentrism, whether about an internal decolonization or in terms of multiculturalism from people coming from elsewhere, we often don't go as far enough in realizing how unsettling it will be for you as a Euro-Caucasian if you are Euro-Caucasian. So when I was working at McGill, I was working in accessibility. This is just an anecdote, but it's one of the points where in my life and in my lived experience, I've encountered it and had to really reflect and had to really think, what is actually multiculturalism here? What do I need to actually do to go to the end of this process? So I was working at McGill. I was director of the Office for Students with Disabilities, and I was very rarely seeing students by this point because I had 10, case officers that were actually doing the front line, but I tended to see graduate students if the case was complex. So a student made an appointment, and I decided to see her, and she came in. Now, in higher education, we have a principle of data sort of protection for students, that first of all, the student has to make the appointment for services, only the student, not their parent, not their wife, not their boyfriend, only the student, and that normally we only talk to the student themselves. So the student has to be present in the meetings, and it's them directly that we address, and we don't make exceptions. We don't talk to someone else. But the student turned up, and she had for the anecdote, she had a complex pregnancy and she was a medical resident, and she needed accommodation to finish her program. So she came in, and she was from the Middle East, and she came in with her husband. And so in the waiting room, my natural instinct was to say welcome, and I assumed that he would have stayed behind, but he came into the room. And then when we sat down, he said, I will speak for her. And then she nodded and she approved of that. And that went against all of my training Also, to be honest, reflecting, I am my parents are divorced. I've got a very sort of single feminist mother. I grew up in that environment. So just, first of all, that made me feel really unsettled. It also went against the grain of the whole sort of value system that's put in place with student services. And so it's in moments like this that you really have to think, what is multiculturalism? And multiculturalism in Canada goes very far. It actually says that really we should not consider situations like this from our own cultural values and habits and frameworks, but from the framework of the person who actually has arrived in Canada and continues to retain to their values and habits and sort of and lifestyle. So in that instance, it would have been very easy for me to say, no, sorry, I'm not doing that, or I'm sorry, I can only talk to you. But really, I haven't regretted. I just went ahead and said, fine, if that's what you want and that's what you feel okay with, then we will proceed in this way, and I'll talk to your husband, and he will, talk to you. And we did, and the appointment was okay. Now, I'm not saying I'm at ease with that, and that's what multiculturalism is about. It's not saying that you are relinquishing your values, but you're giving someone else the opportunity to retain theirs and their cultural heritage and the values that go with that cultural heritage without imposing yours on them. So as you see, it's something that can be really unsettling. It's very unsettling to your Caucasian sort of perspectives within Canada. And people sometimes throw around the air this notion of multiculturalism, but multiculturalism is a very, very powerful, word that has to be taken to its ultimate logic. And sometimes people will say that they are for multiculturalism, but they never really have to consider it in one of these circumstances. So that said, that term and that concept is strong enough that you might think it is enough for the purpose of Unit 1 and Unit 2, right? The concerns that we have. I would argue that it's still not enough because multiculturalism, even in a Canadian constitutional sense, it advocates tolerance and acceptance of other people's retaining their value and their system. But it doesn't actually require you to be curious about these values and these lifestyles and these habits. So it is still very much a sort of, cohabitation, but not a curious cohabitation. And obviously, it's better than nothing. And well applied multiculturalism in a constitutional sense would go a long way to eradicating some of the oppression marginalization that we've seen described in Unit 1. But I argue it doesn't go far enough. And I think at this stage we have to look at something beyond multiculturalism that is really represents a curiosity for other people's cultures. And in particular, within Canada, not just curiosity about cultures overseas of people who are immigrated, but also the curiosity of towards indigenous cultures within Canada. It has to go beyond tolerance. It has to go beyond cohabitation. It has to go beyond the fact that we tolerate that someone retain their lifestyle and their values. It has to be that we are curious and we want to know more about these values. And I think that's really going to be the key to the next step in eliminating some of the oppression marginalization that we've seen in developing or so described in Unit 1. Now, you might say, where does that happen? So I encourage you to look at New Zealand and the work that's been done with the Maori in New Zealand, because it has gone much further than we are in Canada, and obviously much further than Australia has gone, because it hasn't gone far at all. In a sense that really what it advocates is a curiosity. It's what I'm talking about, a curiosity that goes beyond cohabitation. And so how have they done that? It's good to know the story historically, because you may think New Zealand is a philanthropic country that just happens to want to decolonize early. That's not the case at all, and I think we have to remember that actually the story, the history of colonization in New Zealand is atrocious, and that right through the 70s, the Maori people were victim of systematic land sort of theft and removal from indigenous lands, and also literally an almost complete genocide. So by the beginning of the 70s, you have like literally a couple of thousands of Maori left in New Zealand. They've been pushed out of Northern Ireland, pushed out of traditional land, and they converge on Auckland, which is the capital city, because they've lost connection with traditional land and traditional culture. And literally, we're seeing almost the end of a genocide sort of process. But there's a Labour government in New Zealand at that time who looks at this, and again, doesn't look at this from a philanthropic point of view, but looks at this from a point of view of criminality, and sees the Maori, thousands of Maori, families moving into downtown Auckland into a sort of state of homelessness, and decides that this is dangerous for the majority. So it's not a philanthropic. It's not what we're describing in terms of critical theory. It's not a philanthropic interest for the minority. It's a fear for the majority. But that led to good results, because that fear led to a fear of a explosion of criminality in Auckland, downtown Auckland, and that Labour government decided that the only way really to avoid this was actually to engage in a full process of revitalization of Maori culture, which was obviously a return to traditional land, but also a recognition of traditional language. So New Zealand has 3 official languages: English, Maori, and Sign Language, right? Which show you something about the reflection, about putting cultures on par. It also has engaged now for 20 odd years in a process of reforming elementary and secondary education, so that instruction is done in a Maori language for Maori individuals. And if you're Caucasian and you want to teach in a Maori school, you have to take a Maori you have to learn Maori, and you have to take a degree in Maori before you actually, on top of your BL, before you can actually go and teach in a Maori school. So Maori kids are no longer taught up to grade 12, no longer taught in second language English. They're taught in first language Maori, with English being taught as a second language. And it works. It creates this wonderful thing. If you had a chance to go to New Zealand, when you walk around and you see these Maori teens who are speaking English with their buddies and turning around and speaking Maori with their home buddies, and this fluidity that they have really been able to revitalize the language and the culture, and still allow these kids to be really versatile and ambidextrous in this sort of cultural landscape. That's gone pushed way beyond, because now you have Maori higher education. Maori higher education that is not just a copy of your Caucasian higher education, but actually you can take a degree in Maori higher education using Maori methodology. So it's involved now the whole process all the way up to the PhD, where the whole process of learning has been rethought with a focus on Maori's ways of knowing and ways of being. And the result is astounding. But it's taken some odd 25 years to get there. And again, it wasn't necessarily for philanthropic reason that it started, but it still led to conducive results. So why not? And I think that really is what distinguishes New Zealand society at the moment, is that it has gone beyond just tolerance and cohabitation to really having a culture where you are forced to be curious of the other. You're forced to go beyond that and learn the language. You're forced to actually understand the cultural habits of the Maori people if you're Caucasian. So I think that's the essence of a movement of social justice that has gone beyond some of the issues that are still there if all we do is cohabit and sort of accept, but not become involved with people on within another culture or another community or another minority. So I'm not going to swamp you with readings, because you have quite enough reading in this course. But if you are interested, you can jump online and look at some of the Maori curriculum documents. There's a lot of them open access, and see how language is revitalized. Look at how Maori education is done up to grade 12. You can find some things on Maori methodology. There's a great writer called Smith who revitalized Maori methodologies in higher education in the last decade, often cited. But all of this, I argue, is due to the fact that New Zealand now has gone beyond, again, cohabitation tolerance, and gone into a proactive policy of crossing boundaries and making people curious about the lifestyles, and the ways of knowing of others. Okay, so again, to summarize what we've done today, multiculturalism, when it's used in a generic way, is a bit dangerous because it doesn't mean much. In a constitutional way, which few people use it in the proper sense, but if you use it in a proper sense, it is somewhat on the way to getting to the results that we want to see for social transformative action, for social justice. But it also makes people very uncomfortable. So there's a lot of work to be done around properly accepting multiculturalism as a constitutional principle. And I would argue that you need to go even beyond that to something that is more akin to curiosity about other minority cultures, rather than just cohabitation and tolerance. Okay, I hope that closes that for Unit 1, and we'll see you in Unit 2.